March 14, 1944. A B-17 Flying Fortress, call sign Iron Lady, limped across the English Channel like a dying bird refusing to fall. Engine number 2 was shredded, not just damaged, obliterated by flak over Hamburg, leaving a smoking cavity in the wing. Fuel streamed from ruptured lines, painting dark trails along the fuselage. The top turret was jammed, its gunner already dead. By every regulation, every engineering specification, every calculation the Army Air Forces had ever published, this bomber should have plunged into the North Sea 15 minutes ago. But it didn't. Pilot Captain James Morrison kept that crippled machine airborne through raw determination, desperate prayer, and something else, something the maintenance crew had done to his aircraft 4 weeks earlier that wasn't in any technical manual. When Iron Lady finally touched down at RAF Molesworth, it did so on partially collapsed landing gear, the hydraulic system technically registering 0 pressure. Morrison slid that fortress down the runway in a cascade of sparks, visible from the operations tower half a mile away. The emergency crews rushed forward expecting to extract corpses. Instead, they found 7 men crawling out under their own power, traumatized but breathing. The 8th and 9th, the top turret gunner and waist gunner, had been lost over the target, but everyone else made it home despite flying an aircraft that had, according to immediate post-flight inspection, suffered complete primary hydraulic failure, catastrophic fuel system rupture, and electrical damage that should have made controlled flight physically impossible. Base Commander Colonel Richard Hastings stood on that tarmac staring at the wreckage and asked the only question that mattered: how? The official explanation would require weeks. The real answer was already working in a hangar 300 yards away, covered in grease up to his elbows, deep inside another B-17's engine compartment, making alterations that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had bothered to document what he was actually doing. See, the Army Air Forces in early 1944 had a problem they couldn't quite articulate in their after-action reports. Bombers were going down. That was expected. This was war over Nazi Germany after all, and the Luftwaffe wasn't offering mercy. But aircraft were going down from damage that shouldn't have been lethal. A single flak burst in the wrong location and a B-17 that could supposedly absorb punishment that would destroy 3 fighters would simply drop from formation. Something was fundamentally wrong with the design. But Boeing wasn't about to admit it, the Pentagon wasn't interested in hearing it, and crews were dying because of it. Iron Lady's survival wasn't fortune. It was evidence that someone had identified the flaw and fixed it using techniques that would make procurement officers have strokes. This is the story of how one mechanic's unauthorized modifications transformed the B-17 from a statistical death sentence on certain missions into the legendary survivor it's remembered as today. And it started with a guy who'd learned to fix things not in any military technical school, but in a Depression-era garage in Detroit, where the rule was elementary: make it work, or it stays broken.
Technical Sergeant Vincent Rossi wasn't supposed to be working on airplanes. His Army Air Forces personnel file indicated he'd scored high enough on mechanical aptitude assessments to warrant assignment to the motor pool: trucks, jeeps, the unglamorous equipment that kept an airbase operational. But someone in the personnel office at Molesworth had examined his civilian work history and made a lateral transfer that probably saved hundreds of lives. Before the war, Rossi had operated a repair operation in Detroit's Italian neighborhood, where he'd kept delivery trucks, taxicabs, and the occasional bootlegger's souped-up Chevrolet running on budgets that would make poverty look generous. He arrived at Molesworth in September 1943, 24 years old, with grease already embedded under his fingernails and an attitude about regulations that his commanding officers would alternately find maddening and invaluable. His first week on the flight line, he observed a crew chief ground a B-17 for a ruptured hydraulic line. Standard procedure, by the book, completely correct according to Technical Manual 0120 EF2. The replacement component was on back order. The aircraft sat idle. The mission departed one bomber short. Rossi asked why they couldn't bypass the damaged section and reroute through the auxiliary line. The crew chief looked at him like he'd suggested using coat hangers to repair the wings. "That's not in the manual, Sergeant." Rossi's response, delivered in a Detroit accent thick enough to cut with a wrench, became legendary in the maintenance section. "The manual didn't grow up fixing trucks during the Depression. I did." Here's what made Rossi different from the mechanics who'd learned their trade in Army technical schools. Those guys could follow a technical directive perfectly, execute repairs exactly as Boeing engineers had specified, and maintain a B-17 to factory standards. Rossi could look at a system that was failing and ask a question the engineers apparently hadn't. What happens when this breaks over Germany and there's no parts depot at 25,000 feet? His genius wasn't in understanding how things were supposed to function. It was in understanding how they could still function when everything went catastrophically wrong. By November, other mechanics had started noticing that aircraft Rossi serviced had a peculiar habit of returning from missions they shouldn't have survived. A bomber he'd worked on took flak through the hydraulic compartment, should have lost all landing gear control, but the pilot managed a wheels-down landing. Another bird lost primary electrical after a fighter attack, yet the instruments kept functioning long enough to get the navigator home. "Coincidence," the crew chief said. "Lucky coincidence." Rossi didn't believe in luck. He believed in redundancy, in backup systems, in routing critical functions through pathways that weren't in the Boeing blueprints because Boeing had apparently never considered what happened when their beautiful, efficient, single point of failure designs met German 88mm flak. While other mechanics replaced components, Rossi was redesigning systems on the fly, using scavenged parts, borrowed tubing, and electrical connections that would have made an inspector weep. The other mechanics started calling him the plumber because he was always rerouting something: hydraulic lines, fuel feeds, electrical bundles. He'd spend hours after official duty hours in the hangars, flashlight clenched in his teeth, rewiring aircraft in ways that never appeared on the maintenance logs because technically what he was doing violated about 15 different Army regulations. When asked why he bothered, given that he could have sat in the motor pool drinking coffee and avoiding trouble, Rossi's answer was simple. "Those guys fly the missions. Least I can do is make sure the plane doesn't kill them on the way home."
The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be indestructible. Boeing's marketing practically declared so, and the early combat reports from 1942 seemed to validate it. Fortresses returned from missions looking like flying Swiss cheese, holes punched through wings and fuselage, yet they kept flying. Crews nicknamed them the Flying Fortress for good reason. These things could absorb punishment that would disintegrate a B-24. But by early 1944, a disturbing pattern emerged in the casualty statistics that nobody wanted to discuss. Aircraft weren't just being shot down by concentrated fighter attacks or direct flak hits to vital areas. They were going down from single points of failure. One hit in the wrong spot, and a bomber worth $200,000 and 10 trained airmen would spiral from formation and vanish. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate of approximately 4% per mission by winter 1943-44. Do the mathematics. A crew's odds of surviving a required 25-mission tour were essentially a coin toss. Something was killing B-17s that shouldn't have been fatal. and it took mechanics like Rossi actually examining the wreckage to identify what the problem was. Hydraulics. The B-17's hydraulic system controlled everything that mattered when you were trying not to die. Landing gear, brakes, wing flaps, and most critically, the turret systems that let gunners track fighters. Boeing had designed an efficient system with primary lines running through the fuselage in meat bundles, because that's what you do when you're designing for peacetime efficiency. But efficient meant concentrated. One piece of flak through the wrong 6 inches of fuselage and you lost hydraulic pressure to multiple systems simultaneously. A bomber could have 3 functioning engines, intact wings, and a healthy crew, but without hydraulics, you couldn't lower landing gear. And a B-17 doing a belly landing on an English runway was often a B-17 that caught fire. Then there was the fuel system, which had its own special method of killing people. The B-17 carried 2,780 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel in 9 different tanks, 5 in the wings, 4 in the fuselage. The feed system was designed so fuel flowed from outer wing tanks inward, maintaining balance. Sensible engineering, except the fuel lines between tanks ran through areas that were directly in the line of fire when German fighters made beam attacks from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock positions. A 20mm cannon round through a fuel line didn't just mean you lost fuel, though you did catastrophically. It meant you now had aviation gasoline spraying inside an airframe where hot metal, electrical sparks, and open air at -40 degrees created perfect conditions for either fire or vapor lock. Rossi had noticed something the engineering reports missed. Aircraft that went down from mysterious causes often showed pre-impact fuel system anomalies. Pilots reported rough engines, then engine failure, then the whole aircraft would shake itself apart or catch fire. Post-crash analysis, when there was anything left to analyze, kept mentioning fuel contamination or air in the lines. What was happening was simple once you recognized it. Flak or bullets would damage a fuel line. Air would enter the system. Engines would start dying in sequence because they were all fed from the same compromised network. And the bomber would go down not because it was too damaged to fly, but because it was choking itself to death. Boeing's engineers had built an airplane that functioned beautifully under ideal conditions. But combat over Germany in 1944 wasn't ideal conditions. It was an environment where every system needed to assume it would be damaged and still had to work anyway. The B-17's Achilles heel wasn't armor or firepower. It was single point of failure design philosophy. And that's what Rossi started fixing, one unauthorized modification at a time.
What Rossi did wasn't technically illegal. It was worse than that. It was unauthorized field modification of combat aircraft systems, which meant if an aircraft crashed and investigators traced the failure to his handiwork, he'd be facing a court-martial for negligent homicide. But Rossi had done the mathematics differently. If he did nothing, the planes crashed anyway. At least this way, they had a chance. The core of his forbidden fix was brutally simple. Create redundancy where Boeing hadn't. Take that hydraulic system with its neat, efficient single-bundle design and transform it into a maze of backup lines that looked like a plumber's nightmare, but functioned when the primary system took a hit. Rossi started scavenging hydraulic tubing from damaged aircraft in the salvage yard, components that were technically supposed to be sent back for official recycling. He'd cut sections of undamaged line, test them for pressure integrity using a hand pump he'd jerry-rigged, and then install them as bypass routes in active aircraft. Here's how it worked in practice. A standard B-17 had one main hydraulic line running from the pump to the landing gear actuators. Rossi would tap into that line at 2 points, one forward near the cockpit, one aft near the radio compartment, and run a secondary line along a different path, usually tucked along the fuselage stringers where it was protected by structural members.
Then he'd install manual isolation valves at each junction point, using parts cannibalized from damaged bombers. If the primary line took a hit and lost pressure, the pilot could reach down. Rossi mounted the valves within arm's reach and manually switched to the backup line. It wasn't elegant. It added weight. It violated Technical Order 01-20EF-2, Section 4, Paragraph 12, Subsection C. And it meant the difference between landing on wheels or sliding down the runway on the belly and praying. The fuel system fix was even more radical. Rossi couldn't prevent fuel lines from getting hit. That was a fact of flying through flak. But he could prevent a hit from cascading into complete system failure. He started installing crossover valves between tank systems using fuel petcocks designed for ground refueling operations. Officially, these valves were only supposed to be used on the ground. Rossi installed them in-flight accessible positions and documented them on maintenance forms as refueling system check valves, technically true, deliberately vague. Now when a fuel line took damage, pilots could isolate the compromised tank and reroute fuel flow from intact tanks directly to the engines that needed it. But the modification that really saved lives involved the electrical system. B-17s had a primary electrical bus that powered everything from instruments to turret motors. One hit to that bus, and you were flying dark. No instruments, no radio, no gun turrets. Rossi started running secondary power lines from the auxiliary generator directly to critical systems, bypassing the main bus entirely. He'd hide these lines inside existing cable bundles so they looked like factory wiring until you actually traced where they went. He used a different color of insulation, red instead of the standard black, so pilots would know which breakers controlled the emergency backup systems. The brilliance of Rossi's approach was that he wasn't inventing new technology. Everything he used was already on the aircraft or in the parts bins. He was just rearranging the puzzle pieces in ways Boeing's engineers hadn't considered because they'd been optimizing for manufacturing efficiency. A bomber coming off the Seattle production line in 1943 was built to be assembled quickly by workers who'd been factory laborers 6 months earlier. Rossi's modifications required a skilled mechanic who understood systems theory and wasn't afraid to deviate from the blueprint when the blueprint was getting people killed. By February 1944, Rossi had quietly modified 19 B-17s in the 303rd Bomb Group. He never advertised it. He never wrote it up officially. He just did the work during night maintenance shifts when fewer officers were around to ask uncomfortable questions. And those 19 bombers were coming home from missions at a rate that was starting to look statistically impossible.
March 22, 1944. Captain William Bradford, engineering officer for the 303rd Bomb Group, was having a very bad morning that was about to get considerably worse. He'd been conducting routine maintenance inspections, the kind where you randomly pull aircraft from the flight line and verify they match their technical documentation. When he opened the hydraulic access panel on a B-17 called Hell's Kitchen and found plumbing that absolutely should not exist. Bradford wasn't incompetent. He'd been an aeronautical engineering student at Purdue before the war, and he could read a blueprint. What he was looking at wasn't on any Boeing blueprint he'd ever seen. Secondary hydraulic lines running through non-standard routes. Manual isolation valves installed in locations that required custom bracketry. Fuel crossover connections that used components from what appeared to be 3 different aircraft types. And all of it done with a level of craftsmanship that suggested this wasn't some hasty field expedient. This was deliberate, thought-out modification. He found Rossi in Hangar 4, working on an engine replacement. "Sergeant, we need to discuss Hell's Kitchen's hydraulic system."
Rossi didn't even look up from the cowling he was torquing. What about it? Bradford pulled out his inspection clipboard. What about it? What about the fact that there are approximately 50 feet of unauthorized hydraulic line installed in non-standard routing with manually operated valves that aren't in the technical orders? Rossi set down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag that was somehow filthier than his hands, and gave Bradford a look that was equal parts exhausted and defiant. You want the official answer or the real one? Bradford's response was immediate. Both. Starting with how long you've been doing this and how many aircraft are affected. 19 aircraft. That was the number that made Bradford's blood pressure spike. 19 aircraft in active service with undocumented modifications to primary flight systems. The regulatory violation was staggering. Rossi could be court-martialed. Bradford himself could face disciplinary action for not catching it sooner. But then Bradford asked the question that changed everything. Have any of these 19 aircraft experienced hydraulic failure? Rossi pulled out a grease-stained notebook from his coverall pocket, his personal maintenance log that wasn't part of any official record. 4 of them took flak hits to primary hydraulic lines. All 4 made it home on the backup system. Hell's Kitchen landed on her own gear 3 weeks ago after an 88 took out her primary line over Brunswick. Pilot didn't even realize he was on backup until I showed him the damage post-flight. Bradford did the mathematics in his head. 4 catastrophic hydraulic hits, 0 losses. The standard statistic indicated at least 3 of those aircraft should have been written off. By noon, Bradford had escalated to Group Commander Colonel Hastings, the same colonel who'd watched Iron Lady's miraculous landing back in March. By 1400 hours, Hastings was in the hangar personally inspecting Rossi's modifications, with Bradford providing technical narration. And by 1600 hours, there was a very uncomfortable meeting happening in the Group Operations Office, where the question on the table was whether to court-martial Rossi or give him a medal.
Major Kenneth Sullivan from 8th Air Force Engineering Staff arrived on March 25th to conduct a formal investigation. He spent 4 days crawling through Rossi's modified aircraft, photographing installations, reviewing maintenance logs, and interviewing pilots. His preliminary report, filed March 29th, contained a paragraph that probably required an hour to write because it essentially admitted the Army Air Forces had been sending crews into combat with preventably vulnerable aircraft. While TSGT Rossi's modifications are unauthorized and violate standing technical orders, preliminary analysis suggests these changes address systemic vulnerabilities in hydraulic and fuel system design that may contribute to combat losses. Recommend against punitive action pending engineering evaluation and controlled testing. That paragraph saved Rossi's career, but it also opened a door nobody in the Pentagon wanted opened. The door that led to questions about how many crews had died because Boeing's design prioritized production efficiency over combat survivability. Colonel Hastings made a command decision that probably bent a few regulations itself. Rossi wouldn't face charges, but he also couldn't modify any more aircraft until the engineering evaluation was complete. And in the meantime, those 19 bombers would keep flying missions because even the brass could read survival statistics. Major Sullivan returned to Molesworth on April 8, 1944, with 2 Boeing engineers, a team of Army Air Forces technical specialists, and a mandate that essentially read, "Prove this works or prove it's dangerous, but do it fast because we're bleeding bombers over Germany." What followed was the most informal, high-stakes engineering validation in military aviation history, testing unauthorized field modifications under actual combat conditions while trying to figure out if you should be documenting this as innovation or evidence for a court-martial. The Boeing engineers, both civilians under military contract,
were appalled at first sight. The lead engineer, a man named Peterson, who'd worked on the original B-17 design in Seattle, spent his first hour at Molesworth using words like contamination risk and pressure regulation concerns and potential catastrophic failure modes. He stood in front of a partially disassembled bomber, pointing at Rossi's bypass lines, explaining to Sullivan why this couldn't possibly work because it violated fundamental hydraulic system design principles established by people with engineering degrees. Rossi, standing there in grease-stained coveralls, let him finish, then asked a question. "When's the last time you flew a combat mission?" Peterson bristled. "I'm an engineer, not a pilot." Rossi nodded. "Right, so you designed this system in Seattle where the worst thing that happens is a failed pressure test. I maintain these birds when they come back with holes in them. Different perspective." What Sullivan proposed was radical. Instrument some of Rossi's modified aircraft with additional pressure gauges, flow meters, and monitoring equipment. Then send them on actual combat missions while recording system performance. In any sane procurement process, this would take months of ground testing first. But this was April 1944. The air war over Germany was hitting its peak, and the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 5 bombers per mission. They didn't have months.
Between April 10th and April 24th, 6 of Rossi's modified B-17s flew a total of 13 combat missions to targets including Berlin, Munich, and Frankfurt. Each aircraft carried additional instrumentation that recorded hydraulic pressure, fuel flow rates, and electrical system performance throughout the mission. 4 of those bombers took battle damage. All 6 came home. The data was irrefutable. On the mission to Frankfurt on April 24th, a bomber called Memphis Belle II, one of Rossi's modified aircraft, took an 88mm flak burst that shredded the primary hydraulic line, exactly where Boeing's design had it running along the bomb bay. The instrumentation recorded primary system pressure dropping to 0 in 3.8 seconds. Standard procedure, the aircraft should have been unable to control landing gear, flaps, or brakes. But Memphis Belle II's pilot, following briefing instructions Rossi had personally given him, reached down and rotated 3 manual isolation valves. The backup system engaged. Pressure stabilized at 87% of normal, lower than ideal, but well within operational range. The bomber stayed in formation, completed its bomb run, and landed at Molesworth on its own gear while engineers on the ground watched their monitoring equipment and realized they were witnessing something that shouldn't exist – a hydraulic system that survived a catastrophic failure. Peterson, the Boeing engineer, watched the data playback in stunned silence. Finally, he turned to Sullivan and said something that probably hurt to admit. "This shouldn't work. The pressure dynamics are all wrong. The flow rates are inadequate, and there's no proper filtration in the bypass system, but it does work. I don't understand why, but it works." Rossi, standing in the back of the briefing room, offered an explanation that probably didn't make it into the official report. "It works because I designed it to work when everything's already gone to hell. Your system works great until it doesn't. Mine works poorly all the time, but it keeps working." The testing phase produced 53 pages of technical data, 13 mission after-action reports, and a conclusion that Air Force engineering couldn't ignore. Rossi's modifications increased system survivability without compromising primary system function. Translation: he'd made the planes safer without making them worse. On April 28th, Sullivan filed his final report with a recommendation that would ripple through every B-17 squadron in England. Authorize field modification based on Rossi's design and begin training mechanics across all 8th Air Force groups.
May 1944. While the Pentagon argued about official procurement channels and Boeing negotiated retrofit contracts that wouldn't materialize until July at the earliest, something else was happening on airfields across East Anglia. Mechanics were talking to each other. And when mechanics talk, they don't discuss policy, they discuss what works. Staff Sergeant Thomas Chen from the 91st Bomb Group at Bassingbourn had heard about Rossi's modifications through a crew chief who'd transferred from Molesworth. By May 3rd, Chen was at Molesworth during a supply run, notebook in hand, asking Rossi to walk him through the hydraulic bypass installation. Rossi spent 4 hours showing him every connection point, every valve placement, every routing decision. Chen went back to Bassingbourn and started modifying aircraft that night. Within a week, the 91st had 6 bombers running Rossi's system. Technical Sergeant David Miller at Thorpe Abbotts heard about it from Chen. By May 12th, the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, which had the worst loss rate in the 8th Air Force, had mechanics working double shifts to install bypass systems on every operational aircraft. They didn't wait for authorization. They didn't file modification requests. They just did it because they'd watched too many bombers go down from damage that should have been survivable. This was grassroots engineering revolution spreading through informal networks while official channels debated committee structures. Master Sergeant Williams at Kimbolton started keeping statistics that the Air Force wasn't tracking yet. In April, before any modifications, the 3079th Bomb Group had a 16% abort rate from mechanical failures during missions. By late May, with 14 aircraft running Rossi's modifications, that rate dropped to 7%. Williams' logbook, unofficial, unrecognized, showed something even more striking. Modified aircraft that took battle damage were 3 times more likely to return to base than unmodified birds taking similar damage. The official authorization came through on May 15, 1944 as Technical Order 0120EF-2-127, Field Modification for Enhanced Hydraulic System Redundancy in B-17F and B-17G aircraft. It was 8 pages of bureaucratic language that essentially said mechanics could now legally do what dozens of them were already doing. But the technical order was cautious, limited. It authorized the hydraulic modifications, but made no mention of Rossi's fuel system crossovers or electrical bypasses, because Boeing was still insisting those were unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Rossi read the technical order and laughed, not a happy laugh, but the bitter laugh of a man who'd watched bureaucracy almost court-martial him for saving lives, and was now watching that same bureaucracy take credit while implementing only half the fix. He went back to installing fuel crossovers on the night shift, unauthorized as ever, because the paper from headquarters didn't change the fact that B-17s were still going down from fuel system failures. By June 1944, the modification had spread to an estimated 140 aircraft across 9 different bomb groups. The official number, aircraft modified under the new technical order, was 48. That gap between official and actual represented mechanics who looked at the regulations, looked at the planes, and made the same choice Rossi had made. Better to beg forgiveness than ask permission when lives were on the line.
The survival statistics started showing up in ways the Air Force couldn't ignore. The 303rd Bomb Group, Rossi's home unit, where nearly every operational B-17 now had the full suite of modifications, including the unauthorized fuel and electrical work, had a loss rate of 1.8% in June 1944. The 8th Air Force average was 3.5%. That might not sound like much, but across a month of operations involving thousands of bomber sorties, it translated to dozens of crews that came home, instead of being written off as missing in action. Colonel Hastings, in a moment of either brilliance or career suicide, invited an 8th Air Force statistical analysis team to Molesworth in early July to review the group's survival data. He showed them everything: the official modifications, the unofficial ones, and the numbers. The analysis team's report, filed July 11th, contained a sentence that validated what every mechanic on the flight line already knew. Statistical correlation between modified aircraft and improved survivability is significant beyond normal variance and warrants expanded implementation. The revolution had become policy. Rossi had become a template. And across England, mechanics were still doing unauthorized modifications after hours because the official policy hadn't caught up to the complete fix yet. They were all Rossi now, every sergeant with a wrench who looked at a regulation and decided that bringing crews home mattered more than following the manual. September 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 4 months when a statistician at Air Force headquarters named Captain Eleanor Wright compiled a report that would never be widely published but told the story in numbers that couldn't be argued with. She'd taken mission data from every B-17 group in the 8th Air Force, cross-referenced it with maintenance logs documenting which aircraft had received Rossi's modifications, both official and the unofficial ones that mechanics had carefully logged after the fact, and run correlation analysis that would have made her statistics professors proud. Groups with 75% or higher adoption of the full modification package, hydraulic, fuel, and electrical, showed a 21.7% improvement in aircraft return rates compared to their pre-modification baseline. That number represented 312 bombers that made it home instead of going down over Germany or the North Sea. Multiply by 10 crew members per aircraft. Factor in that some crews survived even when aircraft were lost, and Rossi's forbidden fix had kept somewhere between 2,800 and 3,500 airmen alive who would have otherwise been killed, captured, or missing. But the number that really mattered was buried in Wright's appendix data. Aircraft with the complete Rossi modification package that sustained Category 3 damage, defined as damage requiring major repair or system replacement, returned to base 78% of the time. Unmodified aircraft with identical damage levels returned 44% of the time. The modification hadn't made B-17s invulnerable, but it had turned survivable damage into actual survival instead of statistical loss. Vincent Rossi mustered out of the Army Air Forces in December 1945 with the rank of Technical Sergeant, an Army Commendation Medal for exceptional technical proficiency in aircraft maintenance, and no mention anywhere in his official record of the field modifications that had defined his contribution to the war. He went back to Detroit, reopened his repair shop in the Italian neighborhood, and spent the next 32 years fixing cars, trucks, and the occasional airplane owned by a local flying club. He never talked much about the war. In 1977, a researcher named Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Air Force Historical Research Agency tracked Rossi down while working on a study of wartime field modifications. Martinez spent 2 days in Detroit interviewing Rossi and reviewing the personal maintenance logs Rossi had kept, the grease-stained notebooks that had never made it into official records. Martinez asked the question that probably should have been asked 30 years earlier. Why had Rossi risked court-martial to make unauthorized modifications? Rossi's answer, recorded in Martinez's interview notes, was characteristically blunt. "Didn't seem that risky to me. Guys were dying because the planes weren't built right. I could fix that, or I could follow the manual. Seemed like an easy choice." The B-17 that Rossi had first modified, Iron Lady, the bomber that started everything in March 1944, survived the war and was eventually scrapped in 1956. But photographs of its hydraulic bay, taken during the 1944 engineering evaluation, ended up in Air Force maintenance training manuals used into the 1960s. The captions never mentioned Rossi by name, referring only to field-developed redundancy modifications. Generations of aircraft mechanics learned from his work without ever knowing who'd done it. Boeing eventually incorporated elements of Rossi's modifications into the B-17G production run, starting in late 1944, though the official documentation credited the changes to
ongoing engineering refinement, rather than acknowledging they were adopting field fixes developed by a sergeant with a high school education who'd learned engineering by keeping Depression-era trucks running. The post-war B-29 and B-50 bomber programs included redundant hydraulic and fuel systems as baseline design features, lessons learned in blood over Germany and applied by engineers who'd reviewed the wartime modification data. Vincent Rossi died in 1992 at age 73. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press made no mention of B-17s or the war, noting only that he was a veteran and had run Rossi's auto repair for 4 decades. His personal maintenance logs, the unofficial record of every aircraft he'd modified, were donated to the Air Force Museum in Dayton after his death. They sit in the research archives now, available to anyone who requests them. 43 notebooks filled with technical sketches, pressure calculations done in the margins, and annotations in a mechanic's shorthand that tells the real story of how one man's refusal to follow the manual changed the odds for thousands of airmen who never knew his name. The forbidden trick became standard practice. The maverick became a template. And the lesson that sometimes the people closest to the problem see solutions that engineers in distant offices miss remains relevant every time someone has to choose between the manual and what actually works when lives are on the line.